On the set of The Return of the King, there was one moment nobody forgot. An 81-year-old actor suddenly stopped Peter Jackson while he was giving directions and shared something that instantly changed the mood. It was about the war, the real one, not a movie battle. The entire crew went silent. Standing only a few feet away, listening without saying a word, was a 43-year-old actor who had spent his whole career searching for that kind of honesty and real experience. That actor was Viggo Mortensen. The older man was Christopher Lee. Now, at 67, Mortensen has started speaking more openly about what Christopher Lee truly meant to him and why those moments stayed with him for so many years. Viggo Mortensen was born in New York City in 1958, but his childhood looked nothing like a typical New York story. Before he was even 3 years old, his family had already lived in Venezuela, Denmark, and Argentina. Argentina became especially important to him. He connected so deeply with the country that Spanish eventually became like a second native language, something that stayed with him throughout his life. When Viggo was 11, his parents divorced. He returned to New York with his mother and his brothers and slowly built a new life. In 1980, he graduated from St. Lawrence University. After that, he spent years drifting from place to place, living in the United Kingdom, Spain, Denmark, and wherever work could be found. He picked up all kinds of odd jobs before heading back to New York, believing he was showing up for an audition for a stage play. Instead, he accidentally walked into an acting school. That unexpected mistake completely changed the direction of his life. His first movie role came in 1985 with a small part in Witness alongside Harrison Ford. It wasn't a huge opportunity, but Mortensen approached it with complete commitment. From that point on, no matter how small the role or how forgettable the movie might have been, he threw himself into every character as if it were the biggest part of his career. While filming the low-budget 1987 horror movie Prison, he pushed himself much further than most actors would. During one scene, he shook so hard that he actually broke a chair. In another, he ran through freezing water wearing nothing but his underwear because pretending didn't feel real enough to him. He believed the performance had to feel honest, no matter how uncomfortable it became. Most critics barely noticed those efforts. That didn't stop him. Throughout the late 1980s and well into the 1990s, the same pattern kept repeating. One movie after another, one unusual role after another, many of them small, some of them downright strange. He even appeared in Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, playing a member of the infamous cannibal family. Then The Reflecting Skin in 1990 finally earned him serious attention from critics. In that eerie story centered on a young boy convinced his neighbor is a vampire, Mortensen delivered a performance that people couldn't ignore. Next came The Indian Runner, Sean Penn's first film as a director. Mortensen played a troubled Vietnam veteran with an intensity that left a strong impression on audiences and critics alike. By 1993, he was working almost non-stop, but the money still wasn't coming in. He appeared in Boiling Point, Carlito's Way with Al Pacino, and American Yakuza. Later, Mortensen openly admitted that he accepted some of those roles for one simple reason: he needed the paycheck and was struggling financially. Even without becoming a household name, critics kept pointing out one thing again and again: Viggo Mortensen stood out every time he appeared on screen. Many openly wondered why an actor with that much talent still wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. In 1995, Crimson Tide gave him his biggest opportunity yet, playing a submarine weapons officer alongside Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. It was another chance to prove he belonged with some of the biggest stars in Hollywood. By the time Ridley Scott cast him as a Navy SEAL commander in G.I. Jane in 1997, directors already understood what made Mortensen different. He never just memorized lines and showed up. Instead, he spent months talking with real Navy SEALs to better understand their world. He even skipped the official boot camp organized for the cast. That decision frustrated several of his castmates. But it wasn't an accident. Mortensen believed his character was supposed to create tension, so he leaned into that feeling to make the performance more believable. The movie received mixed reviews, but once again, people remembered Mortensen's dedication more than anything else. By 1999, He had built an impressive list of film credits, yet fame still seemed just out of reach. Directors respected him, but many moviegoers still didn't know his name. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Before Viggo Mortensen ever joined The Lord of the Rings, the production had already run into serious problems. Peter Jackson originally cast Irish actor Stuart Townsend as Aragorn and spent weeks preparing him for the role after his success in About Adam. But almost immediately, things didn't go the way the filmmakers had hoped. According to widely reported accounts, Townsend wasn't interested in rehearsing the way the production expected. He also chose not to spend time learning horseback riding or practicing the detailed sword choreography before filming. His response, repeated more than once, was, "You'll get it on the day." That attitude reportedly raised concerns among members of the production. Ian McKellen later shared that he asked Townsend directly if he truly wanted to be part of the project. By the second day of filming, Peter Jackson reportedly reached a difficult decision and said, "I don't think I can work with Stuart." That moment completely changed the future of the trilogy. The search for a new Aragorn suddenly became urgent. Jason Patric was considered, but the studio reportedly wanted someone with even stronger appeal. Russell Crowe, coming off the huge success of Gladiator, was also discussed, but he reportedly passed because he didn't want to keep taking similar historical or fantasy roles. With time running short, one name quickly rose to the top of the list: Viggo Mortensen. On paper, Mortensen seemed like an almost perfect fit. He loved the outdoors, was already an experienced horseman, and had a real interest in European history and folklore. That meant the legends and myths that inspired J.R.R. Tolkien's world already felt familiar to him. He didn't have to fake that connection, it was something he genuinely appreciated. But there was one major problem: Mortensen almost turned the role down. His young son Henry was still growing up, and accepting the part meant spending months filming in New Zealand, far away from home. For Viggo, that wasn't an easy choice. He kept weighing the opportunity against the time he would miss with his son, and the decision wasn't exciting to him at first. It felt like one of those moments where work and family were pulling in opposite directions. In the end, the person who changed everything wasn't a producer, a director, or a studio executive. It was Henry. He was already a huge fan of the Lord of the Rings books, and once he realized why his father was hesitating, he refused to let the opportunity slip away. As Mortensen has recalled many times, his son looked at him and more or less said, "Dad, will you deny me the opportunity for my father to be Aragorn?" That simple question cut through every doubt he had been wrestling with, and Mortensen has often said he still can't believe how quickly those few words changed his mind. At that point, Viggo Mortensen hadn't even read the Lord of the Rings books. He didn't accept the role because he already loved the story or fully understood Aragorn. He accepted it because his son asked him to. That simple conversation changed everything, and within just a few days, Mortensen was on a plane to New Zealand, stepping into one of the biggest movie productions in the world. When he arrived, there was no luxury of easing into the role. He had almost no rehearsal time, barely knew the rest of the cast, and was still figuring out who Aragorn really was. Everything happened at incredible speed, forcing him to learn while the cameras were already rolling. Peter Jackson later admitted that Mortensen was still finding his footing during those early scenes, especially Aragorn's first appearance at the Prancing Pony, where Frodo and Sam finally meet the mysterious ranger. Since Mortensen had joined the production only days before filming, that uncertainty naturally showed in his performance. But instead of hurting the scene, many fans have argued that it actually made it stronger. At that point in the story, Aragorn is hiding from the future, waiting for him. He doesn't fully embrace who he is, stays in the shadows, and avoids the destiny everyone expects him to accept. Mortensen's own uncertainty unexpectedly matched the character's emotional state almost perfectly. Rather than looking like an actor who wasn't ready, he came across as a man carrying the weight of difficult choices and hidden responsibilities. The hesitation visible in his eyes during those early moments wasn't something that needed to be fixed. By pure chance, it fit Aragorn exactly as the story required. It became one of those rare moments where real life and the character blended together in a way that couldn't have been planned. It didn't stay that way for long. By the time the story reached the confrontation with the Ringwraiths at Weathertop, Peter Jackson could already see a huge change. Mortensen had fully settled into the role, bringing out Aragorn's rugged, haunted, and determined side while still keeping the quiet dignity that made the character so memorable. One of the trilogy's most recognizable moments even happened by surprise. The famous shot of Aragorn swinging a burning torch toward the camera wasn't carefully planned in advance. It was an improvised moment that ended up becoming part of the final film. By then, Mortensen had completely embraced the role and wasn't holding anything back. His commitment didn't stop when the cameras did. He spent so much time training on horseback that he formed a close bond with his horse during filming. After production ended, he bought the horse himself. He also purchased Arwen's horse for Liv Tyler's stunt double after no one else was willing to meet the asking price. Those animals had become part of the journey for him. Mortensen also insisted on using a real steel sword instead of lighter rubber or aluminum versions whenever it was practical for training. He practiced with it constantly, even away from the set, which reportedly led to more than one awkward conversation with local police who spotted him carrying it around. The film's fight choreographer later praised him as the best swordsman he had ever trained. The stories about his dedication kept piling up. He broke 2 toes after kicking a helmet during one scene, and the real cry of pain stayed in the finished movie because it worked so well. During the battle at Helm's Deep, he also chipped a tooth. Instead of stopping production for long, he reportedly visited a dentist while still wearing Aragorn's costume and fake blood, so filming could continue with as little interruption as possible. Peter Jackson later shared another story that perfectly captured the atmosphere on set. During one conversation that lasted around 30 minutes, he spoke to Mortensen as Aragorn the entire time without realizing he had never once used the actor's real name. It was in that environment where everyone chased authenticity with remarkable dedication that Mortensen found himself especially drawn to Christopher Lee, a man whose connection to realism came from something far deeper than acting techniques alone. For Christopher Lee, realism wasn't something he had to imagine, it came from experience and memory. Born in 1922 in Belgravia, London, to an Italian contessa and a British Army officer, Lee had already lived an extraordinary life long before he ever stepped onto the set of The Lord of the Rings. By the time he played Saruman, he wasn't just an accomplished actor. He carried decades of remarkable experiences that many of his younger castmates knew very little about. In 1941, Lee joined the Royal Air Force and served throughout World War II, eventually becoming a flight lieutenant working in intelligence. Over the years, he occasionally hinted that his wartime service included highly sensitive operations connected with British special units. Whenever the conversation drifted too close to those subjects, however, he would often stop himself and simply refuse to go any further. Some stories, he believed, were better left untold. Producer Barry Osborne, who was present during one memorable discussion involving Lee on set, later recalled that Lee had been connected with British intelligence or related wartime organizations, though the exact details remained unclear. Even people working closely with him never seemed to know the full story, and by all accounts, Lee was perfectly comfortable keeping it that way. His talents reached far beyond acting. Lee spoke 7 languages and had personally met J.R.R. Tolkien decades before Peter Jackson's films were ever made. That made him the only member of the production who had actually sat down and spoken with the legendary author himself. Even more remarkable, Lee made a habit of reading The Lord of the Rings from beginning to end once every single year. It wasn't for publicity or attention, it was simply a personal tradition he kept for much of his adult life. Lee never hid the fact that he originally hoped to play Gandalf. In later interviews, he said it clearly, "Of course, I would have loved to play Gandalf." But by the time casting began, he was nearing 80 years old. The demanding horseback riding, action scenes, and physical challenges required for Gandalf were no longer realistic for him to perform comfortably. Saruman required less physical strain, so he accepted the role that best matched what he could still bring to the screen, and he committed himself to it completely. Despite the 40-year age difference between them, Lee and Viggo Mortensen quickly found common ground. On one side was an 81-year-old war veteran who spoke multiple languages and had known Tolkien personally. On the other was a 43-year-old actor who believed even the smallest details mattered, right down to carrying a real sword because it felt more authentic than a rubber prop. Their shared dedication created an unexpected friendship. While other cast members relaxed between scenes, Mortensen and Lee often wandered off to quiet corners to talk. They weren't discussing Hollywood gossip or industry news. Instead, they switched between German, Spanish, and even Old Norse languages they had learned out of personal interest long before working together. Their conversations explored the ancient legends, history, and mythology that inspired Tolkien's world, topics both men genuinely loved. Those conversations revealed something important to Lee. He recognized that Mortensen wasn't treating The Lord of the Rings as just another blockbuster or a simple fantasy adventure. He approached the story with real respect for its history, traditions, and deeper influences. Lee reportedly admired that mindset because it reflected the same appreciation he had carried for decades. And before long, there was one more detail that caught Christopher Lee's attention: the sword Mortensen carried everywhere. When Viggo Mortensen chose to train with a full steel sword instead of the lighter prop versions, people noticed right away. The weapon had been forged by armorer Peter Lyon, and Mortensen practiced with it constantly to make every movement feel as natural as possible. Christopher Lee, who had spent decades performing sword fights on stage and on screen, watched him carefully. According to accounts from the production, Lee even remarked to the cinematographer that Mortensen seemed to have a natural fighting instinct, something rarely seen in actors who are learning those skills only for a single role. For Mortensen, praise from Christopher Lee wasn't just another compliment. It meant far more than that. Coming from someone with Lee's lifetime of experience, it carried real weight. If Lee respected your work, you knew you had earned it. Then came one of the most talked about moments from the set. During the filming of Saruman's death scene, Peter Jackson reportedly gave Lee direction on how the character should react. Lee calmly interrupted and explained why that particular sound didn't match what he believed would happen. Speaking without drama or emotion, he said he knew what it sounded like when someone was stabbed from behind. Instead of a loud scream, he explained, the air leaves the body in a sudden choked breath. Jackson listened. Rather than arguing, he trusted Lee's judgment and allowed him to perform the scene the way he believed was accurate. According to stories shared later, Lee wasn't speaking from imagination or research alone. His comments reflected experiences from his wartime service that he rarely discussed in detail. It was one of those moments that left a lasting impression on everyone nearby. Years later, Mortensen reflected on what Christopher Lee brought to The Lord of the Rings. He said Lee carried a kind of presence that couldn't be learned in acting classes or created through rehearsals alone. There was a quiet authority that came from having lived through extraordinary events. In a story built around war, sacrifice, and courage, Lee added a level of authenticity that was impossible to fake. For Mortensen, that experience became its own education. He had spent years pushing himself physically, believing that complete commitment could bring him closer to the truth of a character. Then he met Christopher Lee, someone whose life experiences naturally gave him that depth without needing to manufacture it. Watching Lee work showed Mortensen another side of what authenticity could look like. But there was much more to Christopher Lee than the serious image people knew from his famous villain roles. Audiences around the world remembered him as Dracula in the Hammer horror films, the unforgettable Scaramanga in a James Bond movie, and, of course, Saruman. Yet behind that commanding screen presence was someone with a deeply creative spirit. He loved music, recorded opera, and, amazingly, even released heavy metal albums in his 80s, simply because he enjoyed the idea. That unexpected side of him surprised many fans. Mortensen understood that creative drive immediately. He had founded his own independent publishing company, Percival Press, to support poetry, photography, music, and other artistic projects that larger publishers often overlooked. Even though the two men built very different public careers, they shared something important beneath the surface. Both followed their artistic passions because they genuinely cared about the work, not because it was the easiest path or the most popular choice. That shared outlook created a connection that went far beyond the cameras and costumes. Christopher Lee passed away on the 7th of June 2015 at a hospital in London, just 10 days after celebrating his 93rd birthday. Tributes poured in from across the film world, but Peter Jackson's words stood out. He later shared that one of the greatest pleasures of his life had been visiting Lee in London with Lee's wife Gitta after more than 50 years of marriage. They would spend hours listening to Lee tell stories, and Jackson knew many of them were only small glimpses into an extraordinary life that few people would ever fully understand. After The Lord of the Rings, Viggo Mortensen surprised many people by refusing to take the easy path. Instead of chasing bigger franchise paychecks, he turned down several offers because he felt many of the roles were too predictable or lacked depth. He even declined to return as Aragorn for The Hobbit. Since Aragorn does not appear in the original novel, Mortensen believed adding the character would move away from the story Tolkien had written, something he wasn't interested in doing. Rather than repeating himself, Mortensen searched for projects that challenged him in completely different ways. In 2005, he teamed up with director David Cronenberg for A History of Violence, the first of 4 movies they would make together. Mortensen later described it as the best film he had ever worked on, and the partnership became one of the most important creative relationships of his career. 2 years later, he delivered another unforgettable performance in Eastern Promises. Playing a Russian organized crime enforcer, Mortensen threw himself into the role with remarkable dedication. He traveled through Russia without using a translator, carefully studied the meaning behind prison tattoos, and even kept Russian television news playing continuously in his hotel room so he could absorb the language and accent as naturally as possible. That extraordinary preparation paid off with his first Academy Award nomination. Mortensen never seemed interested in choosing the comfortable option. He kept searching for roles that demanded more from him. While filming The Road in 2009, based on Cormac McCarthy's powerful novel, he lost around 30 pounds to reflect his character's harsh circumstances. Between takes, he even stayed in his character's worn, dirty clothes to remain immersed in the role. At one point during filming, someone reportedly mistook him for a homeless man and asked him to leave a store, showing just how completely he had transformed himself. In 2016, Captain Fantastic revealed another side of his talent. He played an off-grid father raising 6 children with a performance that balanced strength, compassion, and vulnerability. The role earned him his second Academy Award nomination and reminded audiences once again how easily he could disappear into completely different characters. Then came Green Book in 2018, where Mortensen transformed himself in the opposite direction. To portray the real-life Tony Lip, the Italian-American driver who accompanied pianist Don Shirley through the segregated American South in 1962, he gained around 20 pounds, mostly by eating pizza and pasta. He also insisted on actually eating during many of the film's meal scenes instead of pretending. One memorable moment even showed him folding an entire pizza into quarters, because that was something the real Tony Lip was known for doing. The attention to those small details became another example of the commitment that had defined Mortensen's career for decades. The film went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, while Mortensen received his 3rd Oscar nomination. At one point, one of Viggo Mortensen's characters says, "Whatever you do it 100%. When you work, work. When you laugh, laugh. When you eat like it's your last meal." Those words could easily describe Mortensen's own approach to life and acting. Every role, every performance, and every decision reflected that same level of total commitment. Nothing about his career happened by chance, and it certainly wasn't driven by a need for fame or constant praise. After becoming Aragorn, he could have spent years accepting similar heroic roles and stayed one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Instead, he chose a different path. He continued chasing challenging, unpredictable projects that demanded complete dedication. Following the same example Christopher Lee had quietly demonstrated years earlier on a film set in New Zealand. For both men, authenticity always mattered more than taking the easy road. Whenever Mortensen has spoken about Christopher Lee, it's with enormous respect. He doesn't describe him as just another co-star. He speaks about him as someone who carried real history into every performance. Lee's life experiences gave him a perspective that couldn't be copied, and that depth helped bring even the most fantastical stories to life in a believable way. That connection makes Aragorn's journey feel even more meaningful. Throughout The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn carries deep respect for the kings who came before him, understanding that their sacrifices shaped the world he would one day inherit. Looking back with the real story behind the scenes, it's hard not to notice a similar sense of admiration in Mortensen himself. During breaks in filming, the man standing only a short distance away wasn't just another legendary actor. It was Christopher Lee, speaking quietly about history, languages, and ancient traditions, while sharing only small pieces of an extraordinary life that very few people ever fully knew. Viggo Mortensen never allowed The Lord of the Rings to become the final chapter of his career. He kept searching for new challenges, continued surprising audiences, and built one remarkable performance after another. Yet when he reflects on that unforgettable trilogy today, it isn't the fame, the awards, the sword he still owns, or even the horses he bought after filming that he talks about most. Instead, he remembers an 81-year-old man wearing a wizard's robe, whose quiet wisdom, remarkable life, and willingness to share his experiences left a lasting mark on one younger actor who was paying close enough attention to appreciate every lesson. That story is a reminder that some of life's greatest teachers don't stand in front of a classroom. Sometimes they simply lead by example, and the lessons they leave behind stay with us forever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves incredible movie stories and behind-the-scenes history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.